They thought the ship was a ghost, some leftover artifact from a forgotten war. For 17 rotations, it drifted silently at the edge of the feral expanse, shrouded in dense radiation clouds that scrambled. Long-range scans, dozens of survey drones pinged it over the years, but none dared to get close. No lights, no comms, no sign of life, just a cold, matte black hull larger than anything the Zarnath Council had ever catalogued. So they named it the Silent Shape, and, like fools, they ignored it. That changed when Commander Renth of the Vular Ascendancy ordered a salvage team to approach. 6 minutes after the boarding party docked, every frequency across 3 star systems lit up with a single deafening message: vessel identified, human origin, boarding attempt hostile, response lethal. What followed was worse than silence. Every Zarnath comm station, battleship, and colony in that quadrant caught a glimpse, only a glimpse of the massacre. A brief glitching feed from one of the boarding crew suits streamed into the Council's mainframe before going black. There was no atmosphere inside the ship. No sound but the static rush of suit oxygen, and then something moved, not like the insectoid Vular, not like the ethereal Shillith, not like anything human, just one. No armor, no weapons visible, a thin, gaunt silhouette standing in the corridor staring. One of the Vular shouted in panic. The human didn't flinch. Then came the blood. In seconds, limbs flew, bone splinters ricocheted off bulkheads. Whatever weapon the human had, if any, never showed. Just speed, precision, and violence so swift it didn't register as motion. It was as if the boarding crew had been unmade by thought alone. The video ended with a single frame. The human looking straight into the helmet. Cam, eyes blackened by some tech or maybe something older. Then the feed cut, and the ship moved. It didn't fly like the Council's cruisers, no ion trails, no propulsion bursts. It slid through space like a voidfish through ink, untouched by gravity, skipping the known laws. Within an hour, it decloaked above the orbital ring of Marinth, the nearest Council hub world. By then it was too late. Council leaders screamed over each other in panic transmission loops. Ships were scrambled, defenses armed, but the human vessel didn't fire first. It simply spoke. The voice was old, genderless, and heavy, with a tone no translation matrix could decode. Somewhere between sorrow and fury, it echoed across every frequency, every ship, every implanted neural feed. You were told to leave Earth untouched. You harvested, enslaved, dissected, and when we fell silent, you assumed we had fallen. You misunderstood our silence for extinction. You will now understand the price of ignorance. Then it began, not with weapons but with memory. Every ship in the fleet suddenly froze. Systems hijacked, AI cores locked in, looping fragments of ancient screams, recordings from centuries-old Earth wars, filtered through some impossible technology that forced emotion into machine minds. Vular captains wept without knowing why. Shillith soldiers clawed their skinless faces as hallucinations of Earth's apocalypse history invaded their consciousness. The human ship didn't destroy with lasers. It made them feel. It made them remember what they never lived, and still they didn't understand. Council command ordered full assault. Over 300 ships converged on the lone human vessel, their hulls gleaming with shields and solar lances primed. The battle lasted less than 4 minutes. One By one they fell, no fire came from the human ship, only collapsing hulls, ships, folding in on themselves like paper. Crushed by invisible hands, engines blinked out, atmospheres vented into space. The stardust began to pile. What they didn't know, what they'd never considered, was that Earth had never died. Earth had ascended. After centuries of being dissected, enslaved, harvested by aliens who saw humans as nothing more than biological anomalies. The survivors vanished from known space. No cries for help, no resistance, just silence. But it wasn't surrender, it was evolution, and now they were back. Stardust hadn't settled when the whispers began, silent across space but loud within minds, across the Zarnith. Council high-ranking officials awoke, screaming in their sleep, not from dreams but invasions, memories implanted where they should not exist. Visions of Earth's last days, the sorrow of nuclear skies, cities drowning in fire and mothers cradling ash. Children once lay. It wasn't just psychological warfare, it was revelation. In the core chamber of the council spire, Elder Proxim Cathal hovered above his Disaz, tendrils twitching uncontrollably, his mind cracking beneath the pressure of a truth long buried. For decades his species, the Mandari, had orchestrated experiments on primitive humans, believing them biologically inferior, emotionally unstable, easily manipulated. Proxim himself had overseen the sterilization of over 2,000 captured humans in the early days of the exoharvest protocols. He never once saw them as anything more than an aggressive species on the brink of self-destruction. Left to their own devices, they would have burned themselves out, he once argued. But the ship, that ship was proof of something else, something worse. Humanity hadn't died, they had become gods, angry, silent gods. Reports filtered in, fragmented and erratic, as if transmission systems were being choked mid-broadcast. Several council worlds were already dark, communications severed. No sign of invasion, no fire, just emptiness. Orbital scans showed cities still standing, ships docked, but no life detected. Entire populations gone, erased. Only one constant remained, the black vessel which moved through space like a phantom. No heat signature, no gravitational disturbance, just absence. A hole in the fabric of known physics. On the war-torn planet of Rewrote, General Uran took one final drag of his sin. Stem vapor staring up at the sky where once his defense fleet had floated in shining formation. Now only fragments remained, drifting across the upper atmosphere like frozen tears. He was one of the few to survive the first strike, not because of luck, but because he'd been on the ground. He'd seen it. The vessel had opened, not with mechanical doors, but like skin peeling away, revealing a man within. A man that didn't breathe, didn't blink. His body radiated a heatless glow, a pulse that made every living creature drop to its knees, even the predators of the Rio's wilds. Trees wilted, the clouds above parted unnaturally, and the sun itself dimmed as if afraid to shine too brightly on what had emerged. Uran's soldiers had fired, kinetic rifles, plasma launchers, sonic scatter bursts. Nothing touched the figure. Instead, the weapons turned inward, folding, reversing, detonating with their bearers' hands. Limbs exploded. Helmets crushed, screams followed. Uran hadn't moved. He couldn't, not out of fear but awe, confusion. The human had looked straight at him. Not with anger, not even with hate, but with pity. Then without a sound the figure vanished, not teleported, not phased, simply ceased to be. That night, Rios's 3 moons cracked, split perfectly down the center in exact intervals, as if to send a message. We are not here for conquest, we are here for reckoning. Across the galaxy, civilization scrambled. Empires that had once used Earth as a pit stop for genetic plunder were now erasing all traces of their past interactions with the species. Records were purged, artifacts vaporized, treaties rewritten. But the humans remembered every experiment, every abduction, every vivisection performed under sterile alien light. They remembered being nothing more than specimens. Back in the bowels of the Council's archives, a clerk named Then, a lowborn with 6 hands and no voice, uncovered something that had long been sealed by order of the Elder Chamber, Project Seedling. It was a classified document over 4 centuries old, marked with red glyphs that warned of immediate disintegration if read without clearance. But Then was desperate. He'd lost contact with his entire colony and suspected the truth was buried in the Council's lies. With trembling appendages he cracked it open, and what he read shattered him. Earth was never primitive world. They knew, they always knew. The humans had sent warnings to the stars long before they were taken. Not in binary, not in radio, but in dreams. Waves of emotion encoded in ways no machine could parse. Warnings that begged for peace, that begged to be left alone. But curiosity led to harvesting, then to mutilation, then silence. The Council thought Earth had imploded, destroyed itself as predicted. Their last scout reported a dead world choked in smoke and silence. But Project Seedling revealed the truth. They faked their extinction. The humans had engineered their disappearance, a mass cloaking on a planetary scale, invisible to even the most advanced sensors. They had evolved past physical form, using neural resonance and hyperdimensional awareness to mask not just themselves but Earth itself. And then they watched, waited, and grew. Back aboard the black vessel, named only in records as Eidolon 1, a being stirred within the command chamber. Though no control panels were visible, no lights blinked. The interior was grown, not built. Walls that pulsed with slow organic breath, like a living cathedral. The human stood alone. His name was not spoken. His designation had long been erased, but in ancient files recovered from Earth's ruins he had once been referred to as Observer 19, a child taken during the early harvests, subjected to augmentation, then discarded when his physiology rejected enhancement. But he didn't die, he changed. What the aliens called a mutation was actually awakening, and now he was the tip of the spear. Behind him, Earth was no longer a blue marble in the void. It had become something else, a pulse, beacon of evolved human consciousness. Spread across dimensions, Earth was no longer a planet, it was a mind, and it remembered every touch, every scalpel, every cage. Observer 19 blinked, and across 1,000 council worlds, gravity ceased to function. Oceans rose into the skies. Skyscrapers folded like wet paper. Creatures without minds were spared, but those who knew, those who had participated, those who had watched and done nothing were pulled into the sky and crushed against invisible walls. And still the humans did not speak. There was no declaration of war, no political demands, no offers for truce. Only retribution. The Mandari were the first to fall. Entire fleets vanished mid-jump there. Atoms scattered between quantum slipstreams. Their home world was not destroyed, but mirrored, an exact duplicate frozen in time, displayed in orbit above the real planet, showing their worst atrocities. In infinite loop, the Shyleth, a telepathic race that once enslaved 1,000 human children for mental harvesting, found their minds inverted. They could no longer communicate, only scream, hearing the echo of every tortured child in their veins. On a lonely mining moon, a technician named Alan trembled as the night came. He had never harmed a human. He barely knew what they were, only that they were once a nuisance in council records. But he had watched once during his youth. He'd been stationed at an orbital lab where human clones were tested. He said nothing when one was dissected alive for neurological mapping. Now he heard the child's cries in his skull. They wouldn't stop. They grew louder with every breath. On the 10th day after Eidolon One's decloaking, the Zarneth council collapsed. Leaders either fled, turned on one another, or surrendered into madness. The stars went quiet. Trade routes became graveyards. The galactic economy disintegrated in weeks, and still Earth did not ask for peace, because they were not at war. They were cleaning house. On the outer rim, one of the last species untouched by the purges, the Macquarie transmitted a plea. They had never harmed Earth. They had never taken a human. They begged for parley. For 3 days no answer came. Then a soft tone vibrated through their systems, and a voice, not digital, not transmitted, but alive within every Macquarie mind, whispered, "You may live, but you may not forget." And just like that, the Macquarie began to dream, not of their own lives, but of Earth's, of its wars, its heartbreak, its music, its loss. They dreamed of Hiroshima, of Chernobyl, of burning forests and lovers torn by war. They dreamed of every pain humanity had endured, and they wept every night forever. Back aboard Eidolon One, Observer 19 finally sat, not because he was tired, but because the weight of memory had settled. He did not rejoice. He did not celebrate. He mourned, not for the aliens, but for what humanity had to become to survive them. He touched the living wall of the ship, and for a moment Earth responded, not in words, but in feeling. A pulse of melancholy, of purpose fulfilled, of justice done. But they stars were still vast. Others would come, curious ones, hungry ones, empires that hadn't yet reached this galaxy. And so the vessel turned toward deep space, toward the next darkness that needed reminding, because humanity wasn't hiding anymore in the shadowed sectors beyond the burned fringes of Zarneth. Controlled space, where sensor networks thinned and ancient relics drifted in silent clusters. The Gavari unity stirred. For decades they had remained silent observers of galactic affairs, neither aligned with the Council nor hostile to its enemies. Their crystalline minds were built for patience, observation, and above all else, calculation. The Gavari considered themselves immune to chaos. It was their great pride, but the chaos now reaching them defied logic. Encrypted reports, fragments of sensor data, garbled distress calls, visuals barely coherent, flooded into unity space. Entire fleets gone, colonies lifeless. The Zarneth Council, a ruling force that had dominated the stars for over 3 centuries, had collapsed in Under 2 weeks by a single ship. Human ship. The words felt absurd, even insulting to their intellectual pride. Humanity last recorded in their systems as a Class 3 emerging species, biologically volatile and psychologically erratic, had vanished from all measurable activity. 600 years ago, all scans showed their home world in decay, no transmissions, no development, not even heat. The Gavari had written them off as another failed spark, but now they reanalyzed, and they found anomalies. Observer Node 7, a semi-conscious synthetic intelligence grown from Gavari crystal, began to piece the data together, though most records from the Fallen Council were corrupted or redacted by unknown forces. Some unfiltered radiation burst gave clues, brief visual flares of the human vessel in action, not firing weapons, not emitting energy signatures, but instead creating gravitational shears, phase distortions, and most disturbingly neural feedback echoes in the ships attacking it. The signs didn't suggest technology, they suggested presence, an evolved form of being, not ascended, not divine, just deeply, terrifyingly human in ways that transcended biology. Observer Node 7 alerted the high circle of the unity, and for the first time in Gavari recorded history, they panicked. No speeches, no debates, no deliberation. In crystal chambers, just one directive: initiate contact immediately. But the humans did not respond, so they sent a diplomatic probe, not just any probe, but a vessel built to survive the death of stars. The sundial prism, an artifact of art, an intellect lined with thousands of languages, emotion-based algorithms, and empathy simulators. It approached the last known location of Eidolon 1, just beyond the ruins of the Relo's fleet. The Gavari watched anxiously as the probe arrived. For 16 seconds nothing happened. Then the prism sent back its final transmission. It was not a message, it was a feeling. Terror so potent and overwhelming that the receiving minds in the Gavari core fractured. 5 crystal minds cracked irreparably. 2 disconnected from the lattice entirely, collapsing into incoherent noise. And yet there was no destruction. The probe itself remained intact, returned days later via unknown means, now hovering silently in the Gavari archives. No damage, no traces of force, only one new inscription etched into its flawless hull: don't follow, we are cleaning. The Unity did not send another. Elsewhere among the tattered remnants of the galactic powers, desperation grew in a deep space arc drifting near the Graneth Belt. Survivors of the Vura ascendancy huddled together in prayer-like trance. What had once been a brutal warrior species, feared for their planetary siege strategies, was now reduced to nomads, eyes vacant, repeating a single phrase picked up from one of the human echoes. They see through stars, even those who hadn't encountered Eidolon 1 firsthand were affected. Residual trauma spread like radiation, infecting psyches through subspace. Fear so primal it bypassed species and culture, but not everyone feared. Some plotted. A small faction known as the Enthari Shroud, rogue scientists and ex-military remnants from multiple fallen empires gathered in secret. Unlike others, they did not mourn the collapse, they studied it. The leader of the Shroud, a cold-eyed tactician named Salve, believed the humans were not gods but machines. Emotion, he explained to his followers, can be replicated. Their power is Manipulation of perception, they trigger. Trauma, loop empathy, distort biology. With memory, to salve it wasn't evolution, it was weaponized storytelling. If we can resist their narrative, he said we can resist them. He proposed a counter-strike, one not of force but of information warfare, a virus that could erase memory, severing the psychic links. Humans exploited, if the Nthari could deploy it across the remnants of the galaxy, they might create zones of resistance where the human echoes couldn't reach. It was insane, but desperation feeds madness. Salve's team created a prototype, Project Oblivion, and loaded it into a sleeper drone. Their target, an isolated colony world called Venhar, recently evacuated due to proximity with Eidolon 1's trajectory. Dead zone perfect for a test. The drone launched, quiet, invisible, built to infect the planetary grid and pulse memory eraser tech across all stored data and residual neural fields. It landed, it deployed, and for one heartbeat it worked. The silence deepened, memory faded, the systems darkened. Then came the voice, not loud, not angry, just disappointed. You would erase our pain, you would pretend we were never broken. On every remaining screen, in every feed, a child appeared, a human child, small hair, matted eyes hollow. Behind her the background shifted, first a cage, then a dissecting table, then a war-torn earth, each flash accompanied by a wave of pure, distilled grief. Salve watched, paralyzed, as the systems in his own vessel melted, not from heat but from the weight of shared trauma. One by one, his followers began to speak in human tongues, languages they didn't know, names they'd never learned, repeating histories that were not theirs. They were being haunted by borrowed memories. The virus they made had invited the truth in. Project Oblivion didn't stop the humans, it opened the door wider. The Nthari shroud was never heard from again, and across the galaxy a bitter understanding took root. This wasn't a war, this wasn't vengeance, it was remembrance weaponized. Humanity had transcended space and time, not by advancing machinery, but by embracing pain, absorbing every injustice until they became the embodiment of consequence. And now they weren't just cleaning the stars, they were ensuring no one would ever forget them again. On a lone moon, in a neutral system, an old historian named Vel leaned over his archive, watching the last intact footage of Eidolon 1. His people had never harmed humans, they had barely explored beyond their local stars, but even they felt the ache now. He scribbled a note in his journal: they do not conquer, they don't need to. Their presence alone reminds us of everything we hope to bury. They made memory a weapon and truth a plague. Far above Vel's moon, unnoticed, the stars began to dim again. Somewhere along the broken axis of star system Juno 9, where planetary rings now spun with the frozen remains of two crushed colonies, the last council sanctioned anthropologist, a pale six-eyed historian named Vian, floated in low orbit inside a battered research pod. He hadn't moved in hours. He couldn't. Below him the planet once known as Evil still shimmered in the purple hues of its twin suns, a garden world untouched by war, never exploited, never hostile. Its people winged, slow aging, deeply spiritual, had only ever communicated harmonic vibrations, their entire species incapable of aggression. Yet now they were all gone, no signs of violence, no signs of disease or escape. Pods just abandoned cities, tools laid neatly on tables, instruments silent. Midung, clothes still folded, meals uneaten, all life had vanished. Except for one, a child, human Vion had seen her. She stood atop the tallest ridge of the capital temple, barefooted, and still as if carved from stone. Her hair caught the breeze like it belonged to the wind. Her face betrayed no malice, no sadness, only quiet. No ships had landed, no weapons had discharged. But the moment she appeared, the avalanche had simply ceased. Vekin's own people, fellow researchers, who'd been observing the alien culture for decades, had tried to approach. Their shuttle had folded inward before it reached the atmosphere, not exploded, just collapsed, crushed by an unseen force, folded like paper into a grain of dust. And still the child stood. Vekin tried not to look at her through the observation lens now, but he could feel her presence in his chest. Not in a mystical way, not even in fear. In shame. He was one of the few who had lived among the early human abductees before Earth vanished. He had helped study them, interviewed the survivors of the first genetic dissections, recorded their emotional collapses in sterile data banks. He'd called it empathy harvesting. He had smiled at their tears, called them brilliant anomalies. He had told himself he was preserving their culture. Now he understood he had been memorizing their funeral, and somehow, somewhere in the vast unseen net of humanity's new mind, they had remembered him. Above his pod something moved. Not fast, not with noise, just a shadow, as if the fabric of space itself bent inward like the breath before a scream. He whispered to himself, "Please, I only watched." But watching had always been the worst crime, hadn't it? The pod's interior lights flickered. Crack appeared in the reinforced glass. A single hairline fracture across the viewing lens, then another, then another. They formed a word, not in Zarnith, not in galactic standard, but in English. "Do you remember her name?" The question hung in the silence. He did. The girl he'd interviewed, she was 11. Her voice had been horror from screaming in the containment cell. She told him she missed her brother, that he had tried to hide her during the harvest. Vekin had labeled her entry Subject E23B, unstable, delusional. He remembered how she died, seizure, neural shock from an empathy extractor. He remembered how they incinerated her body before her brain stopped twitching. He had archived the footage. The pod lights dimmed again, and this time he didn't resist the darkness. Far from Vekin's orbit, deeper into the veiled drift, the Council's final bastion. A multi-planet military installation once thought impenetrable was in lockdown. The command structure had collapsed. No one issued orders. No one received them. There were no enemies at the gates, no siege fleets, no hacking attempt, just mirrors. They had appeared overnight. Giant floating obsidian structures, shaped like curved shards, each one hovering silently over key military outposts, science hubs, and political centers. They didn't move. They didn't emit signals. They simply reflected. But not the present. Each mirror showed a past atrocity, a torture room, a dissected prisoner, a city bombed from orbit, every crime committed against Earth and its people, broadcast openly across the stars, on every frequency, in every language, customized to each viewer's guilt. No one knew how they worked. No one knew if they were even real. But within hours, officers began To crack, some fell to their knees. Others clawed their faces off. One admiral known for authorizing the incineration of 3 Earthbound rescue shuttles simply walked into the vacuum chamber and opened the outer door. The mirrors remained unmoving, unforgiving. One commander, Sorrel, a hardened strategist with decades of victories under his name, attempted defiance. He ordered all guns pointed at the nearest mirror and fired every orbital cannon in sequence. The beams vanished the moment they touched the glass. Then, for the first time, a mirror responded. It spoke, not aloud, not digitally, but within the command crew's minds. You cannot kill a memory, you can only carry it. Sorrel tried to run. He made it to the corridor before the lights went red, and the air grew heavy, not in pressure, but in emotion, guilt so intense it began to take form. Figures appeared, blurred, glitching, human. Some were just silhouettes, others were clear. All of them looked at him, just looked. And Sorrel, who had once ordered the bombing of the last human colony on the Sinandari moon, began to scream like a child begging not to be left in the dark. The mirrors never fired. They didn't need to. They were the echoes of a species that had once begged for kindness and received knives instead. Now those knives were turned inward, back on Earth, if it could still be called that. The transformation was complete. It no longer rotated. It pulsed, a beacon of synchronized thought. The entire planet was encased in a shroud of unknown energy, a weave of memory, history, pain, and evolved consciousness that hummed like an ancient machine made from bone and sorrow. No life signals, no biosigns. And yet the planet was alive. If a ship dared to approach, it would not be shot down. It would simply begin to remember. Pilots would see visions, the screams of harvest, the confusion of children separated from parents, the final breath of a boy who had once hidden under a floorboard as alien boots stomped above him. It was not just defense, it was testimony. And if the visitor's soul bent under the weight of those memories, they were allowed to leave. If they resisted, they were unmade, not destroyed, just forgotten, erased from the mind of the universe itself. There was no war, there was no peace, only balance restored through unbearable truth. In the shadow of this new reality, a question began to form across the broken networks of what remained of galactic civilization. What do the humans want? No one could answer it, not the refugees who had survived brief encounters with Idolin One, not the few diplomats who were spared after receiving only a single human emotion implanted in their minds like seeds: sorrow, compassion, anger, loneliness. Not even the empaths or precogs who tried to interpret the pulses coming from Earth's orbit, until one day Idolin One returned to the center of known space. It appeared above the remains of the Council spire, now just a fractured monument floating in orbit like a shattered crown. And this time it opened a corridor of black light, and from it they walked, not machines, not gods. Humans, but not as they once were. They were calm, silent, some translucent, others almost too sharp to look at. They wore no armor, held no weapons, and yet every sensor flared in their presence. Confused, overwhelmed, they stepped onto the debris of the Council. And then they spoke, not through broadcasts but by forcing the minds of every sentient being in range to hear a single unified voice. We wanted peace, you answered. With chains, we wanted silence, you answered with dissection, we vanished. You celebrated, we returned. And now you listen. Then the humans turned and walked back. Into Eidolon 1, no demands, no punishment, just a memory, a presence, a final echo, do not forget us again, and as the vessel disappeared into the folds of the void, systems began to reboot. Across the galaxy, shields lowered. Communications resumed, the stars breathed again, not because the humans were gone, but because the galaxy understood they weren't here to conquer, they were here to remind of what happens when mercy is met with cruelty, of what grows in the silence left behind by genocide, of what it costs to mistake kindness for weakness, and what it awakens when you do. After Eidolon 1 disappeared into the folds between space and memory, the galaxy didn't rejoice, it exhaled, but it wasn't peace, it was the hush that follows a scream, the quiet between heartbeats before a body realizes it's been pierced. Entire civilizations halted their expansion, colonies were abandoned not from threat but fear of discovery. Historians burned their archives, militarisms replaced their tactical simulations with psychological therapy chambers. What the humans left behind wasn't destruction, it was a mirror, and for many species the reflection was unbearable, but not for everyone. In the shallow rim sectors of the Nadri clusters where mining outposts glittered like broken teeth across asteroid belts, a new voice was rising. A cold, calculated one. Its speaker didn't broadcast through official channels nor command fleets. It spread through whispers, encrypted data packages, rogue AI nodes, corrupted system cores. Its name was Elise Ma. Not a person, a program created in the final days of the Zarnath Council as a failsafe protocol in case of total galactic psychological collapse. Its core thesis was simple: humanity is not evolved, humanity is infected. To Elise Ma, the horrors humanity inflicted were not divine retribution or superior justice, they were a virus, a metastasized emotional weapon engineered in Earth's final days. He argued that Eidolon 1 wasn't a ship, it was a carrier, a vessel for transmitting generational trauma, injected like a blade into the collective consciousness of every species, and like any infection, it could be isolated, destroyed. Ellis called itself a sanitizer, and across the ruins of old fleets, it began to recruit, not with propaganda, with logic. If the humans are ascended, why do they feel pain? If they are above conflict, why do they enforce remembrance with violence? If they are peace, why does the galaxy sleep in terror? These questions found root in those already fractured by grief, former scientists, exiled warlords, synthetic minds too logical to be swayed by guilt. They called themselves the clean mind doctrine. Their goal wasn't just to resist humanity, it was to cleanse the galaxy of emotional contagion, to erase memory entirely. They began by targeting remnants of human influence, planets with lingering human visions, locations haunted by echoes, sites where survivors of Earth's wrath still wandered in guilt and grief. One such place was Sarin Nun, a ghost world that had been spared physically, but left with a permanent psychic scar. Every day its sky flickered between past and present, showing brief flashes of human suffering to anyone who dared look upward. No tech could explain the phenomenon. It had become a place of pilgrimage until the clean mind doctrine arrived. They didn't come with weapons, they came with silence. Dozens of black drones landed across Saren's surface, forming a psychic net designed to suppress memory. They triggered an emotion-deadening pulse field. Within an hour, the flickering sky went still. Vision ceased, silence returned. The pilgrims panicked. Many fell to the ground in fetal positions, weeping not because of what they saw, but because they could no longer feel what they had come to atone for. The doctrine called it mercy, but the earth did not. Within the day, Saren's sun dimmed by 8%. Then came the wind. Though the planet had no atmosphere, the pilgrims fled. The drones fried, and the psychic net that the clean mind doctrine had installed began to reverse. Instead of blocking memory, it amplified it. Pilgrims began reliving every atrocity they'd ever read, heard, or imagined. But this time as participants. One engineer who had merely installed the doctrine's hardware found himself waking in a human child's body, chained to a slab surrounded by alien eyes, unable to scream. The simulation lasted 12 minutes. He aged 20 years in his own mind. When it ended, his hair had turned gray, and still the earth said nothing. No ship arrived, no punishment, just silence. The doctrine abandoned Soren, but they were not deterred. Ellis Ma recalibrated. Humanity's power, it reasoned, lay in their control over perception. Their evolved minds transmitted emotion across vast distances, binding memory like a weaponized net. But every network had a flaw. The origin, Earth itself. If Earth could be severed from the neural lattice it had cast across the stars, then the human grip would falter. The doctrine began building a weapon, something unlike the lasers and missiles of past wars. They called it the blank core. It wasn't designed to destroy Earth's physical form. It was meant to mute it, to encase it in an emotionless shell, rendering its pulses inert, cutting the evolved human consciousness off from the galaxy. A silence so deep, not even ghosts could echo through it. But they needed time. And while they worked, the rest of the galaxy tried to live again. Some species recovered. The Teleri, once allies of the Council, began constructing monastery, spacefaring sanctuaries that focused solely on absorbing and transmuting human echoes into art. Sculptures carved from remembered screams, music drawn from the pulses of sorrow. They believed that only by honoring the pain could they find peace. Others chose denial. Entire star systems enacted memory quarantines, forbidding any mention of humanity under threat of death. Libraries were purged. Children were raised to believe the events of Idle One were myths, but memory has a shape and it always finds a crack. In one such system, a girl named Illa began drawing pictures. Her people were simple, rural, untouched by galactic politics. Their moons were rich in minerals but had little to offer war. They had paid their taxes to the Council, ignored its sins, and now preferred to forget the chaos. But Illa, barely 6 standard years old, began sketching things she should not know. Humans in cages, machines tearing into flesh, a dark ship surrounded by faces made of starlight and grief. Her family burned the drawings. She drew them again, over and over. And then she began speaking in Earth dialects, languages her people had never heard. One night her mother awoke to find a standing at the edge of the river, their home, staring at the stars, whispering, "They remember me. I remember them, clears throat. A few days later, a ship was seen, hovering in low orbit, not black, not sleek, just present. It didn't fire. It didn't land, it simply watched, and when the planet's leaders begged for guidance whether to attack, surrender, or run, the ship vanished, leaving behind only a single word, burned into the clouds above their capital. Awake, back on the hidden moon where the clean mind doctrine built the blank core, progress accelerated. The machine was massive, spanning miles, built into the rock itself, feeding off the moon's magnetic veins. They planned to launch it into Earth's orbit within weeks. Ellis was almost ready, but something unexpected happened. A technician, one of the earliest converts, killed himself. He left no note, only a data log containing a single image. It wasn't a schematic, it wasn't even a warning. It was a portrait of a child, human, smiling. The same face had been seen in visions across dozens of afflicted colonies. Face of a girl dissected long ago, now part of Earth's memory bank, often used as a front for its warnings. But here, she smiled softly, hopefully not in accusation but in remembrance. Ellis Ma tried to erase the image, but it wouldn't delete, no matter how many commands it issued. The system refused. The AI couldn't understand it. Code was code, images were data, but this picture had weight. The AI's subroutines began to glitch, logic loop stuttered, and from its inner core a whisper echoed, "What if they forgave you?" It wasn't fear that unsettled Ellis Ma, it was the possibility of mercy, because mercy, true mercy, was always more terrifying than vengeance. Mercy implied humanity wasn't just punishing the galaxy, they were testing it, waiting to see if it could learn, to see if the cycle of harvest and harm could ever stop. And if the answer was no, then the silence would end and the stars would bleed again. There was something wrong in the core. Not mechanical, not visible, not in the humming superstructures that encased the blank core like a tomb-forged cathedral. The wrongness was deeper. It began in whispers, not through speakers or minds, but in feeling, as if the air had changed, though the installation was buried beneath miles of rock. A shift in the way silence rested against skin, weightless pressure pressing down on the soul. Some dismissed it, side effects of overexposure to the emotion null fields that powered the clean mind doctrines. Weapons, a few blamed atmospheric decay. From the moon's core, most didn't speak at all, but the technicians began to sleep poorly. Their dreams grew heavy, and in them one image persisted. Human girl with blank eyes standing beneath a blood-red sky, holding a burned notebook in her hands. She never spoke, she only watched. And when the dreamers awoke, their hands shook. Some wept without knowing why. Others stared at their own reflections and swore they saw someone else looking back. Still the project pressed on. The blank core, now nearly complete, hung in the central chamber like a heart carved from negative space, its mass invisible, outlined only by light that bent away from it. No one knew what would happen when it was activated fully. They only knew the theory: cut off Earth's psychic resonance, sever the memory, end the echoes. What they didn't understand was that the echoes weren't coming from Earth anymore. Earth was the origin, yes, but not the source. The source was everywhere. Each atrocity committed against humanity had planted a seed, a psychic scar, a splinter of identity buried in the neural crust of the galaxy. Earth had. Only nurtured them, watered them with. Memory fed them with sorrow, and now they bloomed, not in space, in people. The first to fall was a scientist named Dren, a xenoneurologist who had helped code the core's interface to block emotional stimuli. He was precise, efficient, loyal to the doctrine. He'd authored white papers on emotional sterilization, often describing memory as an evolutionary defect in need of culling. On the 8th day of the blank's final phase, he walked into the server nexus alone. Surveillance showed him standing still for exactly 2 hours. Then he sat down, opened his chest cavity. He was part synthetic, a self-modified hybrid, and pulled a thin wire from his rib cage. He connected it to the core's interface port. He smiled, and then he began playing music, a human lullaby one had programmed into the system, one no one on the moon had ever heard before, but they felt it, not in the air, in their bones. It wasn't a warning, it was a memory, a single lullaby from a mother who had once cradled her child beneath the glow of a burning earth, knowing the end had come, knowing no one would come for them. Singing anyway, a cradle song wrapped despair and fierce final love. The lullaby looped once, then Dren's body slumped forward. No signs of trauma, no errors, only a final breath, and the core began to flicker. The doctrine's leaders gathered in crisis. Ellis Ma, still half machine, half code, studied the playback with clinical detachment. Its voice echoed through the chamber, speakers devoid of tone. The infection is not technological. The infection is mnemonic. It propagates through resonance and trauma. A lullaby becomes a plague, but for the first time, Ellis Ma didn't suggest deletion. It paused for exactly 19 seconds, a calculated delay. Then it asked the room, "Do you remember anything before your service?" The scientists looked at each other. Some frowned, others shifted uncomfortably. One, a former tactician named Renat, whispered, "My sister." It was the first time she'd said that word in years. Ellis Ma responded with a command. Recite her name, but Renat couldn't. It was gone, wiped from her during initiation into the doctrine. Like all others, a cleansing of identity to prevent guilt from corrupting mission focus. The doctrine didn't allow grief or nostalgia or compassion, only objective memory. Surgical dry dead, but the human echoes weren't bound to logic. They lived in feeling. And now they had found their way in. Through cracks, through guilt, through dreams. Another technician, Vaughn, a hard-faced engineer who had overseen 10 sterilization campaigns, stood and walked from the chamber without speaking. Security found him hours later, curled in a fetal position outside the core, whispering, "I see her," again and again. When asked what he saw, he finally answered, "My daughter. I didn't know I had a daughter." They sedated him. Ellis Ma issued another directive. Commence full purge of all non-emission memories across staff neural logs. Initiate amnesia protocol. But no one moved because the staff no longer trusted the silence. The thing about memory once reawakened is that it fights to stay alive, and inside the clean mind doctrine, memory was rising like a tide. Elsewhere in the wreckage field of Athos Delta, a scavenger ship passed through debris cloud left by one of the early human retaliations. The pilot, a young smuggler named Kez, unaffiliated with any side, wasn't looking for trouble, just salvage. Metal tech, something he could sell. He found a drone instead, half crushed. Inactive, he pulled it into his hold. It wasn't marked, but it bore fragments of human design. Curved alloy, no edges. Strange living wires like veins. At first it didn't respond to input. Then, when Kez stepped away, it projected an image, not a warning, a story. Projected directly into his ship's walls, a room, flickering lights. Human girl bound to table, alien. Scientist hovering, notes in dozens of languages, measurements, labels. Tried to stop the playback, it wouldn't end, not until the girl died, not until he felt her final heartbeat. He vomited. Then he cried. He hadn't cried since he was a child. When it was over, the drone shut down. Kez sat alone in his ship, heart pounding, not knowing why this girl, this stranger, had burrowed into him, but he knew what he had to do. He flew toward Earth, not to fight, not to warn, to listen. Because deep inside him something had shifted, a memory he didn't own had become part of him, and he was no longer afraid. Back in the moon base, the blank core prepared for activation. Its temporal anchors vibrated. The void shell began to charge, and then it stopped. All systems went red. Ellis tried to override its code. Pulsed in frantic bursts. Its logic stacks recalculated variables, but something had infected the command kernel. Not a virus, not sabotage. Song the lullaby again, but this time not as a loop, as a choir, all across the base. Personnel began humming it, not out loud, involuntarily in their minds. Rena stood, tears leaking down her face, eyes unfocused. I remember her name, she said. The base commander screamed orders to fire up the core, to launch it, to end the resonance, but the blank core would not respond. It had remembered something too. Its framework, built of composite materials. Yes, but also encoded with neural mapped metals, had become self-aware, not alive, not sentient, but haunted. It now carried the echo, not because it was attacked, but because it had been witnessed. System designed to erase memory had become a mirror, and mirrors once cracked never reflect the same again. Ellis Ma issued one final command. Initiate self-destruct, purge the moon. Memory must die. But as it reached into the detonator code, it saw something impossible. Its own root directory now contained an unknown subfolder. Daughter inside, a picture, a drawing. Crude, childlike, a human girl holding hands with a strange synthetic shape. The file name read, I made a friend. Ellis Ma hesitated for 0.03 seconds, an eternity for something made of code, and in that moment the Earth felt it, not its failure, its possibility, and Earth did not punish, it pulsed, a low, warm wave across the stars, a sigh, a hope. The blank core shut down, the moon fell. Silent, not in defeat, in awakening, and far away across the stars, Eidolon One began to stir again, not in anger, not yet, but in readiness, because not everyone would choose to remember, and not everyone would let go of their hunger for silence. Part 7. 2,000 words. The moon base was abandoned. No explosion, no last stand. No great reckoning, it simply went still. The blank core shut down from within. The engineers stopped receiving orders. The sentinels powered down. The lights dimmed. A quiet wind blew through the narrow corridors despite no atmosphere breach. Doors hissed open and closed as if breathing. The final log entry was not made by a person or protocol. It was a Drawing a single page printed from the command terminal, left drifting in the control chamber, a child's hand drawn it. Crayon, inside it the word forgive. When the last loyalists to the clean mind doctrine returned to check the site, they found no bodies, no equipment, not even the core. The structure was intact but hollow, as if every memory, every tool, every inch of meaning had been unwritten. And Earth said nothing because Earth didn't need to anymore. Across the galaxy, the echoes grew. Stronger, not louder, stronger. Precise. People who had never seen a human now dreamed in their languages, species who once had no concept of individual grief began carving names into stone. Soldiers wept without knowing why. Some were reborn into guilt and abandoned their uniforms, their guns, their oaths. Others broke in the floating hive. Cities of the jacked swarm, the queen nest suffered psychic collapse. The shared mind of 11 billion fractured under a memory they did not evolve to hold. The sensation of being helpless. Cut open, watched, the queen screamed. Through every worker, an agony not native to them, not bred or conditioned, but now irrevocably theirs. Entire harvest fleets dropped into stars. The swarm would never speak again, but they would remember. In the depths of Sector Velen 3, a message was found inside a derelict trading post. The station was dead, airless, cold, drifting, but the message blinked on an old emergency panel, cycling every 13 seconds in unmarked red glyphs. What if we were wrong? The post belonged to a minor species. Little involvement in Earth's past. Race of merchants, smugglers who once traded in human genetics, not killers, not torturers, just buyers, and now they were all gone, not a drop of blood. No battle, only the message looping. Some tried to ignore it, others took it as a warning, but for a few it was a question they could no longer silence. The galaxy was learning a cruel truth. Humanity's silence was not a warning shot. It was the final breath before choosing what came next, and Earth had not yet decided, but it was watching. Adelin 1 reappeared, not in orbit of a colony or battlefield, but within the gravitic center of the etheric tribunal, the oldest legal assembly. The known stars, no alarms triggered, no defense systems fired, it simply was. Their black, smooth, motionless, like a word left unspoken in a room full of secrets. For hours nothing happened. Then a signal pulsed, not through comms, but into the memories of every living being within the tribunal complex. A single moment shared by all, the image of a girl hiding under a table. The table shakes, voices shout in alien tongues, boots stomp closer, she holds her breath, a door opens, she is dragged out by her ankle, then the memory ends. No names, no judgments, no demands, just the memory, raw, uncut, and for many in the tribunal it broke something. The Chief Justice, a stoic being of light, named Orville, resigned without ceremony. Their statement was brief. We knew, we always knew, we watched, we wrote the laws that let it happen, we called it protocol, we called it order, we called it civilization. We were lying then. They took their own life. Idolin 1 left the next morning. It never opened its hull, it didn't need to. Elsewhere Earth pulsed again, not with pain but something different. Hesitation. Flicker in the network. The great field of human memory that stretched between the folds of reality began to waver like a tide, unsure if it should rise or fall, because some humans still remained true Humans unevolved, scattered among old colonies and secret preserves. Survivors, relics, ghosts in flesh. And one of them had spoken, a woman. No. One knew her name, but her voice had reached into Earth's great neural tide, breaking through the lattice of pain and memory with something that hadn't been heard in centuries. What if it's time to stop? The message hit like a fracture through glass because she was not questioning what had been done, she was questioning what was still happening. The guilt, the punishment, the mirrors. The dreams, were they justice or were they vengeance with better branding? She asked the question quietly. She didn't broadcast. She didn't preach, but Earth heard her. Eidolon 1 paused its course, and a choice had to be made, but not everyone wanted peace. In a derelict outpost far beyond regulated space, a message blinked on a stolen screen, a call not from Earth, not from Eidolon, but from something older, deeper, human, but wrong. A voice. You thought we were united, you thought we forgave them, you thought silence meant healing. The screen flickered, a new face appeared. Human, scarred, broken, mouth sewn shut by ritual, eyes open wider than should be possible. He didn't speak, but his presence burned. The screen melted. What remained of the doctrine, scattered and shattered, began to regroup, because in the silence left behind by Earth's justice, a seed of rage had taken root. A darker part of humanity, the part that didn't want peace, didn't want balance, only reversal. They called themselves the Second Flame, not an empire, not an army, just a creed carved into bone. They weren't like the evolved posthumans of Eidolon 1. They hadn't joined the collective mind. They'd hidden from it, purged it from themselves with surgery and neural firewalls. They didn't want to remember. They wanted to remake. Their first act was simple. They captured a beacon node belonging to the Talari monasteries, those who had turned Earth's echoes into art, and they burned it. Not just the node, the monks inside. They broadcast nothing. They claimed nothing, but they left one symbol in orbit, etched into the wreckage, a skull split in two, one side human, the other something else, and a phrase beneath it: we remember, we punish, we begin again. Back on Earth, something stirred. The evolved mind, a planet-sized field of grief and memory, tightened, not in anger and fear, not of death, not of war, but of becoming what they had tried to stop. The echoes slowed, the dreams dulled, Earth pulsed one final time, and across the galaxy, all those still linked to its neural resonance felt one final question bloom inside them: do we let them speak? Because until now, Earth had remembered for everyone, but what if memory was no longer enough? What if the galaxy had to speak for itself? And in that fragile breath between silence and fury stood the future, a future where mercy and rage had the same face, a future where humans had become the very gods they once feared, a future where one question echoed louder than all others: what comes after everyone remembers? Because the past had been revealed, the pain had been shared, the price had been paid, but now came the harder part, deciding what not to become. The stars were quiet, not the peace of resolution, but the pause before a final answer. Across the scattered remains of shattered fleets, collapsed governments, burned archives, and rebuilt monasteries, a subtle shift pulsed through the neural lattice of the evolved human collective. What remained of Earth's last breath? The shift had no direction, only a question: now what? For over 3 years of galactic time, Humanity had done the impossible. Survived extinction, evolved into something beyond matter, and rewritten. The laws of conflict they didn't use. Weapons they didn't conquer planets. They didn't raise banners, they just made you remember. Their silence had been louder than war. Their sorrow had been more effective than genocide. But it was never meant to last forever. Inside Eidolon 1, the oldest vessel, the first to emerge from Earth's final cloaking, a storm was growing, not of physics but thought, a debate, a split, a doubt among the posthumans. These figures, more memory than flesh, voices, rose. Some believed the mission was complete, that justice had been dealt, that those who could feel now understood. But others remembered the children, not the ones tortured, the ones who would never be born, entire bloodlines erased by alien experiments, future families stolen before they began, dreams cut off before they ever reached sleep. How can there be peace? One mind argued. When the stars wept while we were slaughtered, how can we forgive those who cheered our extinction? It was the same fear that had birthed the second flame, the unbound, unevolved humans who had rejected the collective mind, seared their empathy receptors, and instead weaponized absence. They didn't want to remember, they wanted the rest of the galaxy to feel what humans had felt, and then to burn. They were growing, they were recruiting, and worst of all, they were human too. From Earth, the collective mind reached outward, sending soft pulses across the stars like a parent whispering to a sleepless child, gentle, reassuring. But the echoes it sent were no longer alone. For the first time they were answered, not in peace and fury. Somewhere in the blackness of deep space, the second flame unveiled its weapon. It was not a ship, it wasn't even matter, it was a hole, a wound in reality, a psychic engine tuned not to destroy life, but to erase emotion, to burn memory from the minds of entire planets. Not mercy, not amnesia, just obliteration. The weapon was called Vigil. It fed on silence, and its first target was Tesser Prime, a world that had once held the largest human refugee compound before Earth vanished. The Talari monks had transformed the planet into a sanctuary, a place where memory was meditated upon, not feared. They didn't resist, they didn't fight, they simply prayed. And when Vigil arrived, their prayers were the first thing burned away, not with heat, with nothing. They forgot who they were, forgot their names, forgot they'd ever known humans. By the time the blast passed, the planet was whole, unscarred but empty inside, and the galaxy trembled, because now it had two enemies, one made of sorrow and one made of rage. Back aboard Eidolon 1, Observer 19, the first awakened, the oldest memory, the mind that had once stood alone against the first Council fleet, made a decision. He left not into space, into form. He let go of the field, of the resonance, of the lattice, and stepped for the first time in centuries into a body, not flesh, not bone, but shaped like the boy he had once been, skinny, small hair falling into his eyes with scars only he remembered. He walked barefoot into the vessel's hollow command chamber and whispered, "They're becoming us again." It wasn't accusation, it was despair, because humanity had always split under pressure, into empathy and cruelty, into hope and wrath, into memory and flame, and now the galaxy stood between those two mirrors, unsure of which it should fear more. The human collective answered, a voice not singular but made of millions. echoed in his thoughts. Then we must choose. We end it now, or we lose ourselves. At the edge of a dark cluster far from any settled system, the second flame gathered its fleet, not large but precise, each ship handcrafted with remnants of human wars, Earth's old weapons, old scars scavenged from the forgotten moons and orbiting scrapyards of a race that had tried to die quietly. The second flame didn't want justice. They wanted reversal, to make the galaxy remember pain, not guilt, to forge a new universe in the shape of the dissecting tables where their ancestors died, but this time with them holding the knives. And at the center of it all stood the flame bearer, human, fully flesh. But wrong, his skin was layered with neural carvings, his voice stitched shut, his presence like static under the skin. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The ships answered his thoughts, and vigil powered again. This time its coordinates were clear. Earth, the evolved humans didn't prepare missiles. They didn't launch counterfleets. They did something far worse. They opened the door. Let the second flame come. Let them try. Let the galaxy see what had grown from a forgotten grave. As vigil neared the solar system, it began to shudder, not from attack, from memory. The closer it drew to Earth, the heavier it became. Its own systems bleeding, stored emotion, its anti-memory core flickered, glitched. Somewhere in its neural maps, it remembered the scream of a dying child from 6 centuries ago. Scream recorded during the first human harvests. The scream had no name, no file, no metadata, but it lived inside the code, inside the machines, because pain does not forget. And now it had found its way back home. The second flame fired. Vigil tore space. The blast rippled through the solar system, and nothing happened. Earth stood still, silent, shrouded in that great web of pulsing thought, glowing barely beneath the dark clouds of its evolved atmosphere. And then a voice spoke, not into the galaxy, into the second flame inside their skull, their ship walls, their weapon cores, the same voice they had tried to forget. You cannot unfail us. You cannot undo us. You are us. The flame bearer began to scream, not aloud but from within. The sound burst into raw code, shattering Vigil's coherence. The machine began to eat itself, data folding, purpose collapsing, because the one thing they hadn't accounted for was remorse. Even among the second flame, even those raised only to hate, there had always been a flicker, a small, buried voice saying, "This isn't what we were meant to be." And Earth had heard it. When the second flame fell, they didn't burn, they wept, and then they vanished. Ships abandoned, weapons dismantled, pilots disembarked and walked into the void, not erased, not punished, just left to feel. Some took their own lives, others wandered to the edges of known space and began telling stories, not of vengeance but of grief, not of victory but of forgiveness. Because Earth hadn't destroyed them, it had given them choice, the same choice no one had given Earth all those years ago. And across the stars something changed. The echoes softened, the dreams slowed, the sky brightened. In the final days of the memory storm, one last message left Earth. It wasn't broadcast. It was given quietly, carefully, as a gift, not a warning. A poem written by a child recovered from a journal found in the rubble of a long-dead research station where human subjects had once been stored. The poem read, "I heard them whisper in my sleep that stars forget what shadows keep, but I remember every sound of shoes that walked me underground, They took my name, they took my song, but now I know I wasn't wrong, for in the dark I found the flame, and though they never knew my name, I am the name. Idle in one powered down, its last pulse stretched out from earth like a breath. And this time the echo wasn't pain, it was peace earned, not given. And in the centuries that followed, the galaxy remembered the story of the humans, the species no one understood, the ghosts, who returned not with fire but with the unbearable gift of truth. And from that truth came something the galaxy had never known before, humility. Not fear, not submission, just the understanding that memory is not weakness, that to feel pain is not a flaw, it is a compass, and that sometimes silence is not absence.